Hello and welcome to the Craft Beer Corner. For today's beer review, we are doing another Tavour review, and today we are doing a couple of different fruited sours. The first beer for today is going to be from a Canadian brewer called Brasserie Dieu du Ciel. That literally means brewery god of the sky. This is their beer Solstice d'été, which means summer solstice in French. This is a raspberry Berliner Weisse, clocking in at 5.9% ABV, and they are based out of Montreal, Canada. Beer number two, you may already have an idea of what it is just based on the label art, but this is Prairie Artisan Ales. This is their Karate Chimp, which is a sour ale that's been brewed with apricot, mango, and tangerine. This one clocks in a little bit lower ABV at 5.4%, and Prairie Artisan Ales is based out of Krebs, Oklahoma. Really excited to jump into both of these. This will be the first beer I have ever had from Brasserie Dieu du Ciel, and certainly we've had many Prairie Artisans, and I always enjoy their sours. So we're going to jump right in, starting with Brasserie Dieu du Ciel's Solstice d'été, the raspberry Berliner Weisse, clocking in at 5.9% ABV. Okay, so jumping right into the first beer of today's fruited sour beer review, we have Brasserie Dieu du Ciel's Solstice d'été. This is a raspberry Berliner Weisse, clocks in at 5.9% ABV, and Brasserie Dieu du Ciel is based out of Montreal, Canada. Again, the brewer's name means brewery god of the sky in French, and the beer name means summer solstice. Turns the label art, it actually looks quite nice. It's got kind of a funky, I don't know how to describe it, like a woman who was formed of the earth, and it looks like kind of a tree nature person, but then a raspberry bush on her head. I don't know, but it looks really neat. I enjoy the label art, and that's about the extent here of labels. So let's get this cracked. Ooh, yeah. I have a feeling this is going to be quite active in terms of carbonation. So let's just get this poured right in the glass. Oh, that is beautiful. That is beautiful. Absolutely lovely beer. That is absolutely lovely. Okay, and oh wow. I can tell you this is pungent. That is a pungent aroma. I can smell it from here. I'm a good foot and a half away. Gosh, you get it right up near you, and yeah, it really comes through. Okay, this may be a raspberry Berliner Weisse, but I'll tell you, this smells just like a classic framboise lambic right out of Belgium. That's what this smells like. It smells pungently of raspberry. And you can smell the sour and the tart. God, it smells delicious. Visually, it is. It's stunning. It's a nice, clear, deep ruby red, clearly full of raspberry, no head, which is great. That's what I want on this sour. So let's just jump right in. It smells great. Oh, oh, that's very nice. That's very nice indeed. Well, it's nice. Even though it's got big aroma and big flavor, it's actually nice and delicate, which I appreciate from a Berliner Weisse. And make no mistake, it's got the classic Berliner Weisse traits that I know and love so well in full force in this beer. This is a really good one. Okay, so first thing, when you first get it in your mouth, you get that pungent punch of sour and tart. I don't get any funk at all. It really does put me in mind of a Belgian framboise lambic. And this is a Berliner Weisse. So it shares all those traits, but it's got the classic Berliner Weisse malt bill trait behind it. Although it's very heavily and raspberry pungent and forward, you do still get that classic Berliner Weisse malt bill characteristic trait, where on the back end, when the raspberry intensity starts to tail off, you do get those kind of telltale baked good notes like biscuits or crust or crumbs, and it has this slight dryness to it. Now, to be fair, you get a slight dryness on many, if not the majority of Belgian lambics, and certainly framboise lambics are no exception. But this is very much reminding me of a classic Berliner Weisse, just heavily, heavily framboise laden. Let me jump back in for body and mouthfeel. I'm going to start to explore the finish. Body is medium. At 5.9, it's about where I expect. Mouthfeel, up front, it feels a lot more like a lambic than it does a Berliner Weisse. And that's really in terms of the fact that it's a lot more brute-like. It's a lot drier than the average Berliner Weisse. They tend to have a bit of a dry finish. This is almost stringently dry throughout. It's got a, even though all the flavors really stick around and they're intense, it does have this nice dryness to it like a lambic or a Huza would have. Very, very nice, very enjoyable. And frankly, it kind of helps accentuate all the interesting way that the flavor comes in, because you get this big burst of sour and tart, and then you get this drying factor. And then the raspberry just explodes in intensity. And then from there, very quickly, it starts to tail off and tail off and tail off, but it's a very, very slow descent. So it's kind of a skyrocket intense, and then a very, 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 very slow descent to the end of the finish. And it's very enjoyable. Get all this classic Berliner Weisse malt traits, but you still have this underlying raspberry flavor that just lingers around the palate. It's got a much longer finish on each sip than your average Berliner Weisse. And being that they put so many raspberries in here, clearly, it's quite nice. It's very enjoyable. It's still bright and refreshing all the way to the end. Mouthfeel-wise, I can tell you, same thing. And when you roll it around the palate, it does get quite creamy. Certainly much creamier than the average framboise lambic, or indeed even the average Berliner Weisse would be. It gets quite creamy, which is an interesting combination because it's got this dryness and then this cream factor when you agitate it around the palate. So texturally, it's very, very interesting. Very nice beer. This is beautifully balanced. It strikes a wonderful balance between being intense raspberry and the base malt bill. I absolutely love it. One more sip for final thoughts. It's so intense. It's got just this intense sour and tart up front, and then just this wonderful explosion of raspberry. It's so big. I don't really have anything else to add other than I absolutely love it. If you're a fan of fruited sours and Berliner Weisses, this is one that you definitely want to seek. I'm going to take my time, sip on this, come up with my scores. When we come back, we will get to our second beer. This is Prairie Artisan Ales Karate Chimp Sour Ale brewed with apricot, mango, and tangerine, and that one clocks in at 5.4% ABV. Okay, so moving on to the second beer of today's Tavour sour beer review, we have got Prairie Artisan Ales Karate Chimp. This one is a sour ale that's been brewed with apricot, mango, and tangerine, and this one clocks in a little bit lower ABV at 5.4%. Again, Prairie Artisan Ales is based out of Krebs, Oklahoma. So, starting with the label art, they always have very interesting label art. This one has a bunch of, looks like apes fighting and in karate gis, and then it's got a giant chimp with a karate gi adorned. I don't know. It's kind of a crazy little label there, but I'll try to angle it near the camera. They always have interesting label art, but nonetheless, let's get this one cracked. All right. And poured right in the glass. All right, looks pretty much as I expected that it would. Quite effervescent. It's going to form a little bit of a head, but I imagine that is going to get out of the way here pretty quickly. All right. Yeah, color-wise, it's very nice. It's a very bright yellow with a slight tinge of orange. Given the apricot, mango, and tangerine, it looks pretty much exactly as I expected it would, and indeed, it is very, very active in terms of carbonation. And of course, the head is essentially out of the way. There's a little cling on the sides of the glass, but that's about it. Let's give it a sniff. It smells nice. It smells very much like a classic Prairie Artisan Ales sour, very pungently sour and tart, and then all of the different fruit that are mixed in. Now, I can definitely pick out the mango. I can definitely pick out the tangerine. Apricot, I'm not entirely... Yeah, I'm sure it's in there, but I can't really pick it up in the aroma. But nonetheless, let's dive right in. Okay, so this is sour and it is tart, but comparative to many of the Prairie Artisan Ales sours that I've had, this one's not as astringently so. It's definitely got a sour and a tart kick, but it's not quite as oppressively sour and tart up front. And it's got just a little hint of funk. Now I can tell you, the fruit definitely come through in the flavor profile, really quite behind the sour and the tart. And what you're left with is a very nice malt bill flavor that mixes with the fruit after the first few seconds. And the malt bill tastes very, very much like a Berliner Weisse malt bill. So it's got this slight dry quality to it, and it tastes like baked goods. You're getting biscuit, you're getting crumbs, you're getting toast, you're getting all of that baked good goodness in the malt bill. And it's just such a treat. Anytime I have a sour that ends like that, I'm always a fan. And it doesn't always have to be that malt bill. It's just the way that it helps finish and kind of cleanse the palate after all the astringency of the sour and the tart. It's really enjoyable, and it's such a complete opposite direction from the sour and the tart. I'm going to jump in for another sip here. Body-wise, this is medium light. Kind of on the fence between medium light and light. It's not really leaning towards medium. It's not a heavy beer in the mouth. Mouthfeel wise, it feels about like I expected that it would, and then you get that slight dryness on the back end, which is quite common in sours and tarts anyway, but particularly pairing with that Berliner Weisse like malt bill, I really appreciate it. It's got this nice clean quality to it. In terms of the way that this beer develops its flavor and how the balance is, I would say overall, it's very, very well balanced. I'm going to have to jump back in to really think about the fruit here. I'm picking some up, but I'm not sure I can get all three. The tangerine comes through. The apricot comes through in the flavor, and the mango's behind. So I couldn't pick up the apricot at all in the aroma, and I could pick up the mango and tangerine. Then in terms of the flavor, the mango is in there. It's behind the tangerine and the apricot underneath that. So they do all make their presence known. And this is not an intensely pungent flavor forward type beer experience. You get a nice burst of tart and sour, but it's not super intense. Then that gets out of the way, opens up to the fruit, and then the malt bill characteristics kind of come up out from underneath that, and then they pair. So you get the fruit flavors that kind of linger around a bit, and they're mixing with the malt, and it's just kind of trickling down to the finish. And the finish is not horribly long. It's not short. I'd say it's high end of average in terms of length, and it is quite nice because the sour and the tart gets completely out of the way, so you're just left with the residual fruit flavors kind of pairing with that malt bill. Very, very nice beer. I really enjoyed this one. I'm going to take my time sipping on this, come up with my scores. When we come back, we will get both beers ranked from top to bottom. Okay, now that we've gotten to enjoy both beers, we're going to get them ranked, starting with the Brasserie Dieu du Ciel's Solstice d'été. This is the Raspberry Berliner Weisse, clocks in at 5.9% ABV. They are based out of Montreal, Canada. So starting with the aroma on this one was positively huge. It was one of those beers you could smell from, I mean, a good 1.5 feet, 2 feet away. Perfect 10 out of 10. For the taste, absolutely loved it. This beer had all of the hallmarks, really, of a classic Berliner Weisse, including that nice classic malt bill composition. but it also had elements that really properly reminded me of a Belgian lambic beer. It was just fantastic. The intensity of the sour and tart and the way that the raspberry flavor came on, it was great. Now, with a caveat to that, many, if not most, Belgian fruited lambics do have a little added sugar, so lactose to help sweeten and accentuate the fruit. That really does kick it up a notch. Now, bearing in mind this is a Berliner Weisse, it's not supposed to be sweet. I think that they struck a really good balance. But that being said, even though it was very pungent with raspberry, without the sweetness, to really play in against it, I would have liked even more presence. And don't get me wrong, it was not weak, but I could have used just a little more raspberry to enhance that side of it, to still play in with that malt bill, just to make the raspberry flavor itself a bit more pronounced. I only docked 1 point though, it gets a 9. For the body was perfect for the style and perfect for the ABV. It gets a 10 out of 10. Mouthfeel, same thing. It was exactly what I expected. There were elements that put me in mind of a classic lambic, and certainly it was textbook for a Berliner Weisse, and they share a lot of commonalities there. I couldn't ask for more. It gets a 10 out of 10. For the finish, very, very nice finish. Quite a bit longer than your average Berliner Weisse, but the length really, the fact that it wasn't short, it wasn't truncated, does not mean that it didn't have classic Berliner Weisse finish characteristic traits. So it did have this nice dryness to the end. It just took a while to get there. The flavors were very pungent, and even after that nice crisp kind of finish with all of the interplay of the baked good notes that you get from a Berliner Weisse, there was still that lingering raspberry. I absolutely loved it. It gets a 10 out of 10. Head and retention essentially didn't form one, so to speak, which is exactly what I want in a sour. 10 out of 10. Appearance-wise, this beer was absolutely lovely. It was just deep ruby red from all the raspberry in there. It gets a perfect 10 out of 10. Balance. I kind of alluded to this when I was talking about the taste, and really, frankly, overall, the balance of the beer was exceptional. They struck a wonderful balance between the classic malt bill and letting the yeast souring do its thing, and then getting all the raspberry in there. But without that added sweetness, which really would not be the most appropriate in a Berliner Weisse, but to really accentuate and play up that flavor, I could have used even more raspberry. And I'll stand by this. It was not weak in terms of the fruit addition. It was very bold. But personally, I could have used just a little more to help strike that balance between fruit, accentuate the flavor even more heavily, and then let the classic Berliner Weisse malt bill come into play. But I only docked 1 point here as well. It gets a 9. Filling in the intangible, I absolutely loved it. I did. I loved the beer. Frankly, it was such a treat. I drink a lot of Berliner Weisses. I drink a lot of fruited Berliner Weisses. This is one of the best I've ever had. It gets a 10 out of 10. Finally, is an example of this style. I really nitpicked, and it was really just being super critical, but 2 categories where it lost 1 point. But frankly, where it lost, it was so insignificant, and the beer was such a strong example of how a fruited Berliner Weisse can and should be done. It gets top points. 10 out of 10 is an example of this style, which brings the total score on Brasserie Dieu du Ciel's Solstice d'été to a 98 out of 100. So this is one of the top scoring beers I've done to date, and well-deservedly so. It was superb. I highly recommend it to any fan of fruited beers, raspberry in particular, or fruited Berliner Weisses. Just a home run of an example. Moving on to beer number 2. This is Prairie Artisan Ales Karate Chimp. This is a sour ale brewed with apricot, mango, and tangerine, clocking in at 5.4% ABV, and they are based out of Krebs, Oklahoma. Starting with the aroma. The aroma on this beer was fine. You could smell the sour, you could smell the tart, you could smell the fruit, but overall it wasn't as pungent as I expected for either just the base beer style and certainly for a Prairie Artisan's offering. It was high end of average, it gets a 6. For the taste, very enjoyable, but again, I was actually taken aback a little bit in how much tamer this was than your average Prairie Artisan sour offering. Sure, it was sour, it was tart, but it wasn't big and bold and in your face. And the fruit were there, but I could have used them in different quantities to kind of balance it out and get more parity, and also just more in general. It was a nice beer, but I would have liked more sour, more tart, and more fruit overall. I docked 2 points, it gets an 8 out of 10. For the body, The body was almost perfect for the ABV for me, and certainly for a sour style. 5.4, it's not that high of an ABV, but I did expect just a little bit more substance than you got. It really didn't have much more substance than that of water. I docked 1 point, I gave it a 9. For the mouthfeel was pretty much exactly what I expected. For the ABV and for the beer style, it had that nice slight brute like dryness to it, which you get from most sours, and this was spot on. It wasn't super thick, but it wasn't completely thin. It was right where I expected for the beer style and the ABV range. It gets a 10 out of 10. For the finish, even though the flavor wasn't as pungent as I would have liked, the finish on this one was quite long. The sour and the tart stuck around a little bit okay, but mostly the story of this beer was how the malt bill and the fruit flavors really stuck around. And in fact, this malt bill reminded me a whole heck of a lot of a Berliner Weisse. So even though it didn't bill itself as such, on the heels of this one, I was drawing a whole lot of parity between the two beers. So, you know, that was one kind of fun and interesting thing to kind of look and see how they compare just between the two. And even though it wasn't as big and bold, and certainly comparative, but not just that, also for a Prairie Artisan sour offering, the finish was still very long. It had very good staying power and was perfectly appropriate and intense for the fruit that they put in there to linger and mix with that malt bill. And it was very nice. It gets a 10 out of 10. Head and retention. Head and retention on this one. It tried to start to form a head at the beginning, but it got out of the way very, very quickly. It didn't even take 10 seconds. That's what I want to see. I only docked 1 point. It gets a 9 out of 10. Moving on to the appearance, this was a beautiful beer. It looked pretty much as I expected that it would for a sour ale, and certainly with that fruit combination. It gets a perfect 10 out of 10. For the balance, really enjoyed the beer. Overall, I did think it was very well balanced and well above average. That said, I would have liked a little more sour, a little more tart, and just a slightly different kind of ratio of the fruit. The mango kind of overpowered a bit. Tangerine came through in different places, different aspects. Same thing with the apricot, but I could have used a little less mango. Just dial it back just a tick to let the other fruit speak in the beer. That in tandem with just a little more sour, a little more tart that I could have used. I docked 2 points on the category. It gets an 8 out of 10. Feeling in the intangible. I did enjoy the beer. I did think it was above average, but I would have tweaked just a few things. I would have liked a little more pungent aroma. I would have liked a little different balance of the fruit to let them all have really an equivalent voice, and a little extra sour and a little extra tart up front. I docked 3, but it's still well above average. It gets a 7. Finally, as an example of the style, I've had many sour beers out there, many fruited sours and many Prairie Artisan, including fruited and sours. This was a good beer. It's above average, but I wouldn't put this in the upper echelon of their offerings or for the style. It does get a 7 out of 10, which brings the total score on Prairie Artisan Ales Karate Chimp to an 84 out of 100. So all total, we're looking at a 14-point spread between the two beers, but both beers well above average offerings and certainly completely different ends of a similar spectrum. If you're a big fan of either sours, tarts, fruited, or specific fruit that are in either of these, I can and do recommend either beer. Folks, that's today's review. As always, I do sincerely appreciate you tuning in today. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you want to stay in the loop when our videos go live to YouTube, you can click the notification bell icon. It is right next to the subscribe button. Until next time, keep it beer, keep it craft. We'll see you on the next one. Cheers.